Welcome to our Summer 2020 online class in the quality of attention. This is the final class of the series, a discussion on attention to liberation. Attention to liberation. And I'd like to go ahead and just start with a little bit of a recap of this week's Dhamma talk and then open it up to comments and questions as we usually do. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yes? All right. Great. So we have been exploring various ways of directing the mind, creating this sense of attention or mindfulness, and then experiencing it in different ways, in action or in sitting or in walking, and also pointing it at various principles or various aspects of experience. And so all of this, we've done all of this in the context of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a path to liberation. So here we are at the end, going to discuss, I hope, a little bit about how all of those things come together and play a role in awakening to reality. So first I talked a little bit about how liberation or freedom or realization is mentioned in various traditions. So there's the ways that it's mentioned that are about liberation in each moment, liberation not as a instantaneous thing, but as something which is always present. And so in that regard, talked about the root sutta or rooted sutta, depending on whose translation you're looking at, in which the Buddha says, among other things, he says, liberation is the core of all things. Liberation is their core. He says they're rooted in desire, come into being through attention, originate through contact, converge on feeling tone, are headed by concentration. Mindfulness has authority over them. Wisdom is their overseer or their supervisor. Liberation is their core. They culminate in the deathless, and their consummation, their pinnacle, is nibbana. So I reference this because oftentimes the Theravada emphasis is on awakening as something that happens at the culmination of the path. And yet there are also ways in which we see the suttas pointing at liberation as always available. And then more frequently, we see that as well in the Mahayana. So you see Hakuin Zenji, one of the great Zen masters who is associated with the Rinzai form of Zen, saying that as practitioners, we are crying out for thirst in the midst of water. Crying out in our thirst while we are in the midst of water. And then later on, he goes on to say, later in his teaching career, he says, and then we learn that without water, there is no ice. So this thing that feels so solid, without freedom, without infinite emptiness that Master Chancha points us out to, it's not possible for it to be as it is. And then there is liberation that is described as the culmination, as one moment of life-changing inspiration, insight, perception, as one sometimes described as a great leap or as oftentimes described in the Theravada and the early Buddhist suttas as a going out, like the flame going out. So this kind of nibbana, the momentary nature of it, if you will, or the realization aspect of it. So we see that in both traditions as well, right? We see Zen Master Dogen in Bendawa says, beings are amply endowed with the Dharma, but without practice, it is not realized and is not attained. And then we see the Buddha saying, without the understanding of the five khandhas, right, or skandhas, it is impossible to be free. Or we see Master Changcha referring to the Great Barrier. So that's the focus of the readings this week. And I don't want to unpack the whole thing again, but just to say, so this is first, the verse we were looking at more specifically is the first of the 10 verses of Unfathomable Depth by the Chinese Buddhist master named Changcha, who lived in mid-10th century. And this verse is asking us about the mind seal, or the verification of mind. And the transmission of that, or the way that that can be received, can be discovered. And he tells us a few of his attributes, like firm and unshaken, similar to what I believe Zen Master Miaoxin was pointing out when she says the mind that doesn't move. Or what the Sutta of the Highest Blessings says, although involved in worldly tasks, unshaken the mind remains. And he says, once you call it the mind seal, it's already meaningless. So the concept is not the same thing as the thing itself. Don't be fooled by some idea of it. And then he gives us this very direct pointer. He says, you must know that in essence, all things originate from infinite emptiness. And so we really need to look very carefully at this phrase, because typical Western thinking would be that nothing could originate from emptiness. And yet, if we understand emptiness as conditionality, as this great unfolding of Dhamma, then we can begin to understand how all things are originating from that. And then he gives us this lovely purity within purity, the lotus flower within a hot kiln. And I don't want to say too much about what I think that means. That might be a good one for all of you to say a word or two about, but we'll see if we get to that. And then finally, don't say that a free and empty mind or free and blank mind is the way. A free and empty mind is still separated from it, from the fulfillment of ourselves as Dhamma, still separated from it by this great barrier. And what is the great barrier? So I could say from the other side of the barrier, that the mind of realization then must be one, if it is not simply a free and blank and empty mind, it must be a mind that then has a profound experience of the diversity of human life. So anything that gets in our way of understanding our innate integration to that diversity and the means by which it arises and the container in which it arises is that barrier, right? Anything that gets in the way. And then I touched briefly on the difference between samatha and vipassana, the sort of two big buckets, if you will, of ways of thinking about meditation practice. And perhaps Master Changcha pointing us at the necessity for both. Whether you understand that to be both within Zazen, within one form, or both as practice in many, 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 many dozens of different forms that we see in the suttas. And then I told you the story of the blue fan. I apologize if some of you have already heard the blue fan story, but hopefully it was illustrative of this, exactly this, how we can, through the practice, we all can begin to see something in our experience that is already there and yet completely new to us. So with that, I think I will open it up to today's discussion. And if there are folks who want to, oh, and I see that there's somebody on the phone, so let me then. If there are folks who want to ask a question or make a comment, then as usual, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. For the person who's there on the phone, if you want to say something, you'll have to just kind of jump in when there's a pause and announce that you'd like to ask a question or say something, because I'm not sure who you are. Yes, Adrian.
So as I was listening to the talk on the last two talks on emptiness, I kept wondering what the connection, or if there is a connection between compassion and emptiness. Because if one of the ways of understanding emptiness is interrelatedness of causes and conditions and everything, and then to me, what that arises in me is a sense of compassion for the world, you know.
Yes, it's a very good question, Adrian. You know, I would point you at a book. The Venerable Analayo wrote an entire book on emptiness and compassion and his view on how those two things are related. But yes, succinctly, you know, just as you were pointing at, if emptiness means is a word that's pointing us at interconnection and the vastness of that as all things are interconnected with other things, then yes, then you would think that you begin to understand your own connection to other beings, other places, the climate, you know, all of it. You begin to really see that sense of how directly we are actually impacting the world around us, you know. And I'll give you a good example of this. I think the Brahma Viharas, the practice of metta and karuna and mudita and upekkha, so the loving kindness is how that first one's usually translated, or I like a kind of universal kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. These kinds of practices, you know, can be misunderstood for wishing the world to be a different way than it is, wishing that the world would be more kind, or that I myself would be more happy, or whatever it is. But actually what I would suggest is that these practices, what they're doing is that we take a pretty mundane experience of one of those things, like compassion, very basic feeling, as we've experienced it toward some person, some pet, some plant, whatever it is. And then we transform it with our breath and with our attention, we universalize it. But the change that happens in the world is because of this change that happens in us. And then there is a difference in everything that we touch and everything that everyone that we speak to, and so on, you know. It has that ripple effect. So I don't understand it as like that. May it be that way, like wishing the change or forcing the change, but rather knowing that whatever is happening here is having an influence.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just to say one more thing about that, Adrian, is the metaphor that comes to mind, or the metaphor that's sometimes used is the hand. So if I'm the thumb, let's do it this way. If I'm the thumb and you're the pointer finger, you know, from a superficial view, I look at you and I go, wow, we are just totally completely different. We're a different size, we live on a different continent, we have a different function, you know, we see the world differently from our different places, and so on. And yet, if I am aware of the hand, if I'm conscious of the whole hand, the interconnectedness that we're experiencing, because this is connected to this and this is connected to this too, right? Then I would never conceive of harming you here, right? Because we're non-separate then. So even the whole idea of harm goes out the window. Okay, other comments or questions? Thanks, Adrian. Yes, Michaela.
Hello, Dhammadipa. I was thinking, could you talk a little bit more about Rooted Sutta? You talked primarily about freedom at the core of things, but there are also other sections like contact is the origin, feeling is their meeting place, attention produces them, and so on. So I thought if you could share some thoughts.
Sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Yeah, so Rooted Sutta, this is, as I said in the talk, it's one of the more enigmatic suttas. It's a little mysterious, huh? But it's good for us to explore it a little bit and see what we think this means. So the Buddha says things are rooted in desire, and I take that to mean more specifically the word that we often use in the 12-fold chain that we looked at before of craving, right? So there's this thirst, or this kind of craving, or this kind of chasing after experience, all sorts of experience, usually pleasant, what we think will be pleasant anyhow. And that is one of the main, in fact, the Buddha pointed at craving and at ignorance as the 2 points in the 12-fold links of causation, the 2 links at which we could actually make a difference, the places where we could cut that chain. So saying that things are rooted in desire means that's that sort of chasing after experience together with the principle of karma is what is creating human life coming forth again and again and again. That's the Buddha's way of understanding it. So it starts out by pointing at the chain. And this idea of attention produces them. This is where it gets a little complex. So this has been the source of much debate, and various traditions, I would say even whole traditions of Buddhism have come out of how to understand this idea that attention produces things, produces dhammas. So one way to understand it is, where we started out back in the attention to action and talking about almost like quantum physics, right? The way in which our very presence with a thing, our very attention to a thing is sort of shaping that thing. Right? So quantum physics is saying, and goodness knows I'm not an expert, but is saying that the shape of a thing or its position in space, for example, is not determinate until we observe it. And then on our observing it, that aspect gets pinned down. And the other aspects are actually less determinate. And then we look at another aspect of it, and that aspect gets pinned down, and the other aspects are less determinate. So that's one way of thinking about it, the sort of what I think Dogen was referring to, not meaning quantum physics, but what I think Dogen was referring to when he talked about penetrating a thing with our attention, the way that we are creating in part merely by pointing our minds at something. So attention produces them. Another way to think about that is to look at experience as something that is mediated by mind. It's mediated by mind. So it's not to say that there isn't a physical world, but it is to say we can only experience the physical world through a consciousness, through a conscious mind, right? That's another way. And then again, whole schools have come out of that. Mind-only school, the Vanyamaka school to some extent is also involved in that, so on. Contact is their origin. Contact is their origin. So this has to be related, right? So contact is happening, what did we say? When there is a sense organ and a sense object and a receiving consciousness. And when those 3 things happen, then the little ball lights up. Maybe you remember the prapa. Ding, the little ball lights up and it's present for some amount of time while changing, and then poof, it goes out. Yeah. So contact is their origin, meaning, so again, I think that one way that I prefer to think about the way that the Buddha is speaking here is when he's talking about dhammas, he's talking about phenomena, the way that we experience phenomena. And so we have to withhold the typical Western desire to essentialize the material world for a minute, and just think about what is it that we're talking about in terms of our experience of phenomena. So contact is the origin of our experience of phenomena, right? If we didn't have the ear, a functioning ear, and a consciousness to receive the sound, then as far as we're concerned, that hasn't occurred. There has not been a sound, right? Or we can feel it through vibration in the body. But then again, that's an organ, that's a sense organ of touch, of skin, or of the muscles even, receiving a kind of contact. And then feeling is their meeting place. So we talked about feeling tone. This is what kind of feeling we're talking about. We're talking about the tone of things. Feeling is their meeting place, meaning well, it could mean something like feeling always happens when there's contact. There's that part of it. That's the way it's typically understood, traditionally understood. Feeling always happens when there is contact. Those three things coming together. But then this is where it starts to get more esoteric, because then you have to say, well, what exactly is meeting there though? Because feeling is a mental phenomena. Feeling is a mental phenomena that's a byproduct of the physical phenomena. And immersion is their chief. So now this is very classic early Buddhism. Immersion, or this is what he's translating, what Bhante Sudaso is translating as immersion. That's his favorite term for samadhi. Okay, samadhi. So some people would translate that as concentration. I think in contemporary times we've moved away from the idea of concentration, because from samadhi as being concentration, because concentration often for Westerners has this sense of like, used to be also translated as one-pointedness. But the samadhi experience is much more like an immersion than it is like a pointiness. It isn't that kind of a mind. It isn't sharp in that way. It's sharp, but because it's clear, sharp like in focus, like the camera lens being in focus. So immersion is the chief of what? Of Dhamma phenomena. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That kind of composure of the mind, is the chief. It's a very enigmatic statement, because that kind of composure of mind typically involves a falling away of perception and a falling away of the sense of self, the distinct separation between the one supposedly observing and the phenomena observed. Mindfulness is their ruler. So this is, I think, a pretty clear statement, meaning that it is by mindfulness that we become able to be responsive to phenomena. That's how I understand that statement. It is by our clear, sort of heightened, non-judgmental attention in the present moment that we can actually begin to be responsive to phenomena. Prior to that, there may be all these other things happening. There may be feelings about the phenomena, or some kind of, bodily contact that's happening, all of that. But we haven't actually yet, we are not yet able to meet it until our attention is there, right? So I use the example of, you walk into the house and you set down your keys, but if your attention is on getting to the fridge so you could get a glass of something to drink because it was a hot day outside, then you won't remember having put down your keys, right? That phenomena happened, but your mindfulness wasn't there. So you're not able to be responsive to that phenomena anymore. That's why you can't find it in memory. And then wisdom is its overseer, right? So wisdom, again, pointing at the other side of the chain that the Buddha said we could break, the other side of the 12-fold links of causation, or the 12-fold chain of dependent origination, which is what? Which is ignorance. Our ignorance about the nature of reality, our ignorance about the way things actually work, is what drives us continuing to be involved and entangled in it in ways that create suffering. And so wisdom oversees phenomena. Wisdom has the big picture of how phenomena actually are, instead of ignorance about how phenomena actually are. And then we said that freedom is their core, liberation is their core. I think that is something that can be deeply experienced. And it requires, actually, intentionally or unintentionally, I would say most often the unintentional ones are the deepest ones. It requires a relinquishing our idea about what their core might be. Whether their core is some permanent essence, or a soul, or a, element, a physical element, or any other thing that you might think of, consciousness. There are all sorts of different things that we inadvertently believe are the core of the phenomena that we're experiencing. And when we have to relinquish that in order to experience the true core. And notice that he's not saying that the core is a thing. It is a liberation. It's a verb. Or, well, liberation is a noun, but it's pointing at a verb. All right, and then finally, I'm going to finish the answer to this question. Culminate in the deathless. The deathless. They all phenomena end up at a place which is not caught in this place of activity. So it is to say that it is, I take that phrase again, very enigmatic. You could take it, where I'm happy to have a dialogue or a debate or a discussion about what all these things mean. But that particular one, I take it to mean something like, so there's something like coming from a place of stillness, like there is a stillness within the mind, even when there is activity happening, and there's a stillness within things that is even when they are in the process of falling apart. That's what I think is talking about there. The deathless meaning not dying, not falling apart. And then extinguishment is their final end. So nothing is permanent, absolutely nothing. Not deities, not people, not states, not even these principles we're talking about, like karma and emptiness. That's what the Diamond Sutra says, right? Emptiness is also empty. Emptiness is also a condition, a conditional thing that is arising out of other conditions. So there's nothing permanent. Nothing whatsoever. All things are extinguished at one point or another.
Thank you.
Anybody is welcome to offer different interpretations. This is really a good one, and it's yeah. It's always interesting to me to see whether we can relate our particular experience to what's being said here. Yes, Dana.
Well, at a moment they was explaining, you know, what is the Great Barrier, and we're talking about the 3 marks of existence. But then a little farther along, you may have said, or I read, kind of all blurs together, the Great Barrier is really the sense of self. And then I got confused.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
I mean, why? Yeah, I got confused why that would be so, if, you know, because of the 3 marks of existence, which really don't have to do with the self. So I'll let you answer.
Yes. Well, let me go back to the notes that I was making there, because the 3 marks of existence. So I think that maybe the confusion is the 3 marks of existence are the things that are experienced when we cross over that barrier. They're things that are actually to have some kind of visceral lived discovery of the 3 marks is what we mean by liberation. So it's defined in various different ways, but one of those ways is to see the, so the 3 marks again are impermanence and non-self, and in the early Buddhist teachings, dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness or the suffering. I think in this case, when we talk about the 3 marks, it's better to think of dukkha as being that, as being the sort of fundamental unsatisfactoriness of things, rather than using this word suffering more specifically, which feels to me like more limited and smaller. Yeah. Or in the Mahayana, we talk about nibbana, things abide in nibbana, right? Just as the Root Sutta is saying in the deathless, that deathless and although actually, yeah, that last one, the extinguishment is the nibbana in this particular sutta, and the vimutti is what's being translated there. Oh no, amatogata, sabbe dhamma amatogata. Anyway, I'm getting off of my Pali here, never mind. So seeing the 3 marks is liberation, is freedom, is having crossed over the barrier. So the barrier is that sense of self, or as I was saying earlier today, the things that get in the way of you actually having that lived experience of non-self, right? Of having that lived experience of impermanence, of having that lived experience of all things, you know, being either fundamentally unsatisfactory or resolvable, completely extinguished.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I want to say also that that idea of experiencing non-self, of actually seeing the lack of self in a human life and the things that are going through our bodies and minds, it can be very subtle, you know. There's a sutta, I want to say it's Upali, but I can't recall perfectly, so I may be wrong about that, but Venerable Upali, not the householder Upali, who says, you know, he's being asked, oh, well, are you an arhat? Are you a perfectly realized being? And he says, no, I'm not a perfectly realized being. I still have a sense of self. And he says, and so they, whoever it is that's asking him, the questioners say, well, wait, is it that you think that there's a self in your mind or a self in your body? And he says, no, I'm clear about all that. But I'm clear that there's no self in any of that, but I still have a sense of self. And it's a kind of a funny dialogue, because it's like, oh, right, they're about to school him on, you know, that there isn't a self in the mind. You know, if you look at this experience or that, you know, idea or that concept or this thought process, you're going to tell him all about the 5 khandhas. And he's like, no, I get that. But I still have this experience of, you know, of the self, of phenomena happening to me, right? Or of somebody driving the bus, or of any number of other ways that we have a sense of self. Yes, Chris. And then Jack.
All right, so maybe I'm just getting this like twisted up in my head as I listen to the last couple of questions and your explanations, right? But the experience I'm having in the moment, right, to just bring it right into this very moment, is confusion,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And so if I try to apply this sutta to confusion, right, then but what's the desire, right? The desire is to not be confused, right? To eliminate the confusion. That's the craving, which will then create action, right? So in this case, asking you a question, right? Or it could have been getting lost in thought, like trying to figure it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like at a certain point, these things like these concepts, they fold on top of each other. Like I was trying to think that what confused me is the fact that the principle of impermanence could also be impermanent. Right. So then I sort of said, oh, impermanence can be impermanent. What does that mean? Right. And then that's when I realized, oh, I'm having confusion. That confusion is grounded in this desire to understand. Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You could just say, fine, just leave it. Be confused. But if you could use that as to kind of point at anything in terms of practice that's related to this statement that we're looking at in the sutta, I'd be kind of curious to see what you thought about that.
Okay. Well, if it would be the most helpful thing to say, just drop it, Chris, I would. That could often be the most helpful thing. So I'll hold that out as a possibility for you after you hear my explanation. That still might be the best way to go. Okay. But here's what I'm saying. So in terms of the one particular question about impermanence being impermanence, think about again the ball, right? So contact happens. Boom. And you get a moment of ear consciousness. That's what the little light in the ball represents. And what I love about the ball is that the little light is blinking. It's going, and then it goes away, right? So what's happening there? There is something that the early Buddhist teachings, which is very distinct, I will say, from later teachings, and I'll tell you that in a second, but the early Buddhist teachings refer to as persisting while changing. So what is this persisting part, right? It's not that, at least as it's understood in the early Buddhist teachings, that there's a phenomena and it immediately goes away. There's something happening there that has a continuity to it, right? And yet there is the changing, there is the impermanent, there is the basic kind of changing situation happening. So then are we saying, oh, is it changing or is it not changing? Well, it's persisting while changing, right? So that's an example of a kind of mundane way of thinking about the impermanence of impermanence. And then just to add one little drop on top of that, which is there are, again, later Buddhist traditions that posit a kind of momentariness about experience. And Zen is one of those. Zen is one of the traditions in which we often hear people say, it's like a flashing in the moment, like all of existence is a flashing in one instant, and then the next instant, and then that's gone, and then the next instant there's another flashing. Okay. And for me, I think that is going a slightly bit, is basically like you're looking at the same thing and you're calling it something different, right? So when those different states of the ball, for example, would be considered to be one different flashing, so to speak. But I don't think that all phenomena is like going away. I think that's one of the ways that's misinterpreted. Phenomena are different. If you took a slice, and that's how I was hoping that you heard me speak about it during this class. If you take a slice at any given moment of time, you have, a set of causes and conditions. And if you take the next slice, then you have a different set of causes and conditions because things are changing. But it's not that it all went away and then came back, right? I don't think that that's an appropriate way to understand it. Okay, so going back to the sutta, right? So the question about what is the desire when you have confusion, right? The desire is for the confusion to go away. right? So you have a negative Vedana about confusion. You have a negative feeling tone about the confusion. And your response to that, as you said, was to ask a question or to take some action or to do something with it, right? So in that way, what's happening is that you could say, in keeping with what the sutta is telling us here, that you basically have responded to that desire. And you did it by taking another intentional action, and that other intentional action then has a corresponding whole set of stuff, right? Another feeling tone, another contact, another, right? It's all, and then you decide, oh, did you like that or not? So then, oh, maybe you didn't like what happened when you asked the question, and then you say, oh, I'm just going to check out. So we want to aim for a neutral feeling tone instead of a negative feeling tone. You see what I'm saying? So there's this entire process that's being driven by those tones, or this responsiveness of desire or aversion, which, right, aversion is like negative desire, so to speak, to that process time and time and time again. And in that, if we look at that retrospectively, so if I look at you from right now, back the last 5 minutes or so, then the person that I see is those set of responses, mental and physical, that are happening in you in response to those contacts, right? We just string it all together and say, oh, this, and give you a name and say, oh, name and form. That's, the Buddha called it that, name and form. This is name and form Chris, and name and form Chris looks like this, behaves like this, is having this reaction to this. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think seems like the coda to that is what the Buddha is saying here is that either you can recognize that desire to get rid of the confusion, that negative Vedana, is itself impermanent and just let it be, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could look at it through the lens of wisdom. Well, I guess in some ways that's the same thing, really, right? It's like, okay, recognizing that desire as impermanent, as not self, and simply a phenomena of the universe, right? Which doesn't necessarily require an action, but recognizing that if you take an action, it starts a whole cycle of other reactions.
Exactly. And having that spaciousness, both the awareness, right? This is why mindfulness is so important, right? Having that conscious awareness of what's happened there, and then with the wisdom seeing, oh, so then yes, so then I can choose to do something or not do something with this, right? That is the application of the wisdom. And then again, it's like, oh, do you choose to do something that's going to bring more dukkha, or do you see, oh, no, if I do that, then that brings more dukkha.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Well, I will work with that as opposed to drop it. So thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I think that is a good point to end on there, Chris, for this bit of the conversation, to say, I don't think that wisdom by definition says drop everything, right? The Buddha didn't do that. The Buddha did, he got up off the seat of enlightenment. He went and he taught and he told people, oh, you really should be following the precepts, and you really could, like, stop killing people. And right, he didn't just let it all go. He, with wisdom, then responded to the environment that he encountered, the things that he encountered. Jack, I think it's your turn.
Yes, I'm reflecting on your comments about how things culminate in the deathless. And just a reference that I think I've made earlier, Shelley and I were in a position to study this Satipatthana, and we were directed to listen to Venerable Analayo's guided meditations in sequence, and one of them being meditation on death. And there was a point where he sort of set the meditation up, and then in his melodic voice, he said, and now the time has come for us to die. And other people may react differently, but my reaction at the time was, I would say, somewhat profound, because it hit me very, very hard. I mean, I felt it in my stomach and my head, and it was not fear, it was just sort of a sense of the existential. And, you know, I remember just all instantaneously recall seeing all four of our parents die, for example, and whatever that sensation was. And the fact is, though, I have returned to that in meditation since then, all spring and summer, and I feel like it's been somewhat helpful in us understanding a sense of detachment and attempting in today's language to get past the barrier. But what I'm reflecting on right now is there's still a me attached to the sense of the existential, whether it felt like emptiness or not. And so if everything culminates in the deathless, then in my practice, I have to get past being drawn to that emptiness of death. Does that make sense?
You have to get past being drawn into the emptiness of death. Yes. Well, I suppose that you know, the self, just as this language I was using just a moment ago, if we think of aversion as being a sort of negative desire, right? Then that, and you said it was an aversion, so there's something in there, some more gray state that isn't quite that far. But yeah, I think that what I am hearing you say, Jack, is something like the mind wants to go there and resolve it in a certain way. The notion of death. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that it actually feels somewhat instructive to sort of explore that feeling, and whatever my reaction was when he said, and now the time has come for us to die.
Yes.
That feels helpful, actually, not morbid, not suicidal, but just helpful.
Yeah.
But again, in today's language, if things culminate in the deathless, then I feel like I need to get past a self that actually experiences what I experienced when he said, now the time has come for us to die.
Yes. Okay, now I see where you're going with this. Yes. That's right, Jack. And I would propose that getting past that self that finds the contemplation of death helpful isn't something that is going to be driven by that very same self. It's actually yeah. So what I from my experience, what I would say is we we can't look at non-self very directly. We can look at all the phenomena and then see that there's not a self there. And so in a sense, the self drops itself off. This is how it's actually spoken about in Zen, which I think is very fascinating. Because, you know, if we think about, for example, the Buddha saying that all perception is like a mirage, right? All perception is like a mirage, or like the human body is just like a lump of foam, right? All of these different ways. So if we think about a mirage, it's like, yeah, you approach the mirage and you get closer and closer, and you see the sand and you feel the heat. And then you say, oh, there's no water here, right? And so that's why the Buddha gave us all of these very detailed frameworks for looking at the mind, for observing the mind and observing the mind-body interaction and our interaction with the environment and our interaction with death, right? Because what he's saying is just keep looking at the mechanism. So the content, getting comfortable with the content and knowing that stuff is very helpful. And actually learning something about the process of it and the mechanism of it, right? Getting closer to the sand, if you will, and feeling that heat is what's actually going to go, aha, look, there's no water here. There's no self here. So I would say there's more hope, in other words. It's much more hopeful because the self, the sense of self, isn't very good at, you know, driving toward its own demise. It's actually much easier for us to say, no, 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 come here, look at the sand, look at the sand, look at the sand. No, no, just look at the sand. And then the self will be willing to look at the sand and feel the heat. And then, oh, wow, there's this other incredible, you know, phenomena experienced, or lack of phenomena experienced. Hopefully that's helpful in terms of what you're saying, Jack, because I am agreeing that you do, that is the next, that is kind of the next step, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. No, very helpful. I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And just to say, for some folks who are not familiar with the Satipatthana, with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, that contemplation of contemplation of death and of corpses in particular, and oneself as a decaying corpse and so on. This is called the Subha practice. And it is a practice that was recommended in the Satipatthana, a kind of meditation that the Buddha recommended, that we start to approach our bodies as something that is inevitably going to fall apart, and fall apart in ways that will make us unrecognizable, so to speak, you know. And so it can be really, really heavy practice. It can be very difficult practice. So I don't want to encourage anybody who doesn't feel drawn to that to go there, because you need some stability, and you usually need somebody to be with you, you know, as you start to get deeper into it. But that is one of the sort of more traditional ways of starting to loosen up our grip on identification with the body. Yes, Shelley.
So we studied the Satipatthana with Shyla Catherine, and she was very good about telling people that it can be very difficult and painful. And then when people were not ready for that part of the Satipatthana, just to back off and leave it till you're ready. And I liked her approach. Kind of in response to your discussion with Jack, there's 4 lines from the 10 verses. I love these verses. And so out of every one of them, there'll be like 1 line I feel like I kind of get and 6 I don't.
Okay.
But I feel like you should do a class in each verse. Okay. So I love the contrast between these 4 lines. Verse 6, I just want you to comment when I'm done. The Song of Returning Home. Don't be distracted by the King of Emptiness when you're still on the way. I thought that kind of addressed the previous discussion. You must drive your staff forward, moving on until you reach home. And then when you jump down to verse 7, the Song of Not Returning Home, the first two lines, having the intention of going to the source, of returning to the origin, is already a mistake. Yeah. Essentially, there is nowhere to settle down, no place to call one's home. So I didn't understand everything in those two verses, but those 4 lines really spoke to me, and I love the contrast. I wondered if you might comment. Or
Sure.
not, or
yeah.
decline.
No, it's great. I think this will take us to the end of the class. Right. So don't be distracted by the King of Emptiness. So this line, it's so interesting because, you know, again, these poems have been interpreted in various different ways. But in particular, you know, so there is one way of understanding it, which is to say the Buddha is the King of Emptiness. So one way of understanding this line is to say you can't kind of ride the Buddha's coattails. You have to do your own work. That's why the next line is, you must drive your step forward, moving on until you reach home. So in the same way that the Buddha told Patachara that I cannot help you, right? But he gives the direction, and then we do our own work with it within this set of our particular causes and conditions. So that's one way of understanding this. Don't be distracted by the King of Emptiness when you are still on the way. And the other thing, and the other way of adding to that, I would say, is something like, you know, don't get caught in your own ideas either. Don't get caught up in your own ideas, and just keep flowing with your experience. And if you keep flowing with your experience, you know, almost like an echo of the end of that first verse as well, right? It's like, it's not just a blank state. It actually, this kind of flowing with your experience and working with that will eventually lead you to this next state that's talked about in the next one. So it will eventually lead you to a state of surrender and an opening to the nature of reality, right? So this is also the way that we very typically teach the 7 factors of awakening. Maybe Shaila touched on that in the Satipatthana as well, right? In the Dhammas. Like those first 4 are very active: mindfulness and investigation and energy and joy, very active, very engaged, energized. But then you get to tranquility, and you get to samadhi, and you get to equanimity. So you get to these more surrendered kind of states, or these more opening kinds of states that are less driven. So this first Song of Returning Home, those first 2 lines, is the driving part, right? Is saying, yeah, just keep going, keep your intention, right? Just as we've been talking about all this time, attention, the quality of attention is an intentional action. It's a sankhara. It's a mental formation. And we can use the sankhara in a positive way. But then having the intention of going to the source is already a mistake. So what does that mean? It's pointing to the impermanence of things, and saying there isn't a source. There isn't a one single origin, right? If you read the beginning of that article from Bhante Piyadasi about the 12-fold chain, he says that over and over and over again. There is not a first cause in Buddhism. We're not looking for a first cause. What we're looking to do is understand the process nature of things. And so this is why having the intention of going to the source or going to the origin is a mistake, because it assumes that there is some fixed point out there, right? Or in here. And so that second line, though, essentially nowhere to settle down and no place to call home, right? So the beauty of the path is that the path is always a path. Even at the culmination, even having attained liberation, the path is still a path, right? The Buddha gets up and he goes and he teaches, and he has to come up with all these different metaphors and ways of talking about what he experienced, right? In fact, he tells the story. This is the Buddha's great humility. He tells the story that the first person he encountered when he got up from under the Bodhi tree, the first person he encountered, he told them, I am a conqueror. I am somebody who has ended death, and so on. And that person said to him, oh, may it be so. And they shook their head and they walked away. And he tells us this story. Why? Because he's giving us exactly that same example, right? He had to meet the causes and conditions. And in that moment, he met them in such a way that this person couldn't actually see the beauty of what he had experienced. So he was learning as a teacher too, even after he was enlightened. So the path is always a path, and that's why there is no place that we call our home. Or conversely, as we tend to do in Zen, you could say, make every place your home, right? It's one of the Terry poems. That's one of the poems in the Therigatha. When you have really made peace with the three marks of existence, then every place is your home.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I gave a retreat on, as you saw, there were some talks from that retreat, but I thought about giving a class on this poem, but then I decided it was a little too much Chinese poetic metaphor for people to deal with 10 weeks of that. Yeah, so unless somebody has one last burning comment or question, I just want to say thank you all for participating. It has been a real treat to practice with you. I especially appreciate that you shared your poems and that you, shared your practice with each other and came to know each other a little bit here and there. It was beautiful, maybe more than a little bit that I don't know about, but the interactions on the forum and the dyads and here, responding in ways to or reacting to each other's questions and comments, and it's beautiful. So I really, really appreciate it, and I hope that you all are continuing on with the Dhamma of this body and mind. Don't forget that you are your own Dhamma. If you take nothing else from this course, you could do that. Pay attention to your own Dhamma, because it's right here. And with that, I think that I'll let you all go. Be well, and keep an eye on the calendar. There's a couple of teachings that haven't gone up on the calendar, and probably won't until this retreat is over. But just in terms of next up, there is likely to be a talk with Sacramento Buddhist Meditation Group that's going to be Zoomed on Sunday the 6th. Then there definitely will be, as far as if things go as planned, 2 talks that I'll be offering on Sunday the 20th, one with the Berkeley group and one with the San Francisco Dharma Collective group. And all of those links are on the Lokavihara website, and they will also be on my blog website. And then also Red Clay, the day retreat with the Red Clay Sangha, hosted by Red Clay Sangha in Atlanta. That's happening November 7th. And looks like New Year's retreat is going to be online this year, the Lokavihara New Year's retreat. It'll be a little shorter, probably 5 days. And it's going to be capped. Actually, I thought it was going to be unlimited enrollment, but it looks like it's going to be capped at 200. And we had 184 for our retreat with Spirit Rock, so it could very well meet the cap. So you can begin to register if you would like, probably the end of this month or so. All right. So again, be well, everyone. Keep practicing. And thank you so much for your Dhamma.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thank you, Dhamma.